shortly after this photo was taken, these two men vanished, along with the answer to a $1 million question that has haunted the world ever since. Those men were about to make their final push to Mount Everest's summit, aiming to be the very first people in history to reach the top, to reach the highest mountain in the world. But over 100 years after that photo was taken, we still don't know if they did it. We still don't know the truth. And the most disturbing part is that there's a very real possibility that somebody out there wants to keep it that way. You see, this isn't just a story about a mountain. It's a 100-year mystery filled with unanswered questions and the chilling possibility that a powerful circle of people don't want the truth to come out. So is the answer to Everest's greatest conspiracy still frozen on the mountain somewhere, or has it been covered up forever? Folks, those are the questions that I'm going to be tackling in this video. Oh, and by the end of the video, you're also going to see some brand new evidence of how right now we're closer than ever to uncovering the truth. So this mystery starts all the way back in 1924. So I invite you to come along with me right now on a time travel trip. And this trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer. I happen to know that there's a ton of you out there that watch a lot of my videos, but you haven't subscribed yet. And so if that is you, please subscribe and help us get to our very ambitious goal of reaching 1 million subscribers this year, which is crazy. We'll see if we can do that. But anyways, let's go back to 1924. Are you ready? Here we go. 3, 2, 1. All right, we've made it. So the British are attempting to make history by reaching the summit of Mount Everest, you know, the highest mountain in the world, no big deal, for the very first time. And the crazy thing is the British have been striving to win this race to the top of the world ever since the end of World War I. And they had even assembled a small team of elite climbers in order to make this happen. Now, two of these climbers were 37-year-old George Mallory and 22-year-old Andrew Irvin, who went by the name Sandy, so that's how I'm going to be referring to him for the rest of this story. Now, it was not George's first time on Everest. In fact, it was actually his third time. He had been part of the British effort to reach the summit almost from day one. And so he had actually been to the base of Everest multiple times. In fact, in 1922, George had actually set a world record by climbing to an elevation on Everest of 26,800 feet, which is about 8,200-ish meters. And that was a world record at the time. No one had ever climbed to that elevation before. Sandy, on the other hand, well, he had never been to Everest before. He was a lot younger. Again, he was only 22. He was fresh out of college. And truthfully, he probably wouldn't have even made it onto the expedition if not for two important factors. Number one, Sandy had studied engineering in school, and he was known to be very skilled with the oxygen technology, the canisters, the tanks that they were using. And number two, well, they just thought it would be good to bring some young blood to Everest to kind of shake things up a little bit from the past expeditions. And so on the very first day of June in 1924, George Mallory and a few other folks, including Charles Bruce and a number of porters, well, they made their very first push for the summit, but they ended up turning back due to bad weather. And then the very next day, two new climbers that were part of the expedition, Edward Norton and Howard Somerville, they made a summit attempt as well, and they actually made it a lot closer than the folks the previous day. They set a new record at the time for the highest altitude that was ever climbed, and also the highest photograph ever taken, by the way, but they too would end up turning back. And as you can see in this photo, they were so close to the top. You can see the summit up there, but it's a really good thing that they turned around because, well, they both nearly died on the descent shortly after this photo was taken. And so that brings us to George Mallory once again and his younger climbing partner, Andrew Irvin. And so a few days later, it's now June 6th, 1924, the two of them left their camp high up on the slopes of Mount Everest's north face, and they started their push for the summit. They emerged from their tents, they rigged up their oxygen equipment, and while they were doing this, fellow expedition member Noel Odell snapped this photo right here, which would go on to be the last photo of the two men. Ooh, did he say last photo? That probably means something disturbing is about to happen, which is the truth. And so before we get there, let me keep things light for just a moment longer and tell you about Drink Element. Let me ask you a question. Do you sweat? I mean, you probably do, right? I'll speak for myself. I certainly do. I sweat a lot. In fact, whenever I'm working out or hiking or even just like doing yard work or whatever, shoveling my driveway, I sweat a ton. And here's the thing. When you sweat, you get thirsty. You want to, replace the water that you sweat out, but that's really not enough. What you need to do is replace that water and replace your electrolytes. If you don't replace your electrolytes, you're gonna get fatigued, you're gonna have muscle cramps. Anyone who thru hikes or does like a long backpacking trip will always take electrolytes with them because it's just really bad for you, and you can honestly have some serious problems if you don't. And that begs the question, which company should I get my electrolytes from? And I got an answer for you. It is Drink Element. Their drink mixes taste so amazing. Citrus salt, grapefruit salt, those are two of my favorites. Orange salt, kind of a sleeper flavor as well. And if you're feeling super crazy, they have some flavors like mango chili or chocolate salt. And even beyond their amazing flavors, Element is the only electrolyte company that I've seen that doesn't put sugar or other crap and BS inside of their drink mixes. I mean, these days, everything we eat, it seems like, and everything we drink has like all these terrible things. A lot of us are trying to stop consuming that stuff, myself included, and so Element is perfect for this. So what I need you to do is go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go place an order of whatever flavor sounds best to you. Honestly, I would start with citrus salt. Again, that's my favorite. And when you do that through my link, which you can also click at the top of the description, you're gonna get a sample pack of 8 additional Element flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost, so you can just sample pretty much everything they have to offer. So one more time, that's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Click that link and let's get back to the story. So 2 days after George Mallory and Andrew Irvin started their summit push, 2 days after that famous last photo of them was taken, Odell, the same guy who took the photo, he was looking high up on the mountain when all of a sudden he witnessed the clouds kind of just clear out for a brief moment. He said, quote, "My eyes became fixated on one tiny black spot silhouetted on a small snow crest beneath a rock step in the ridge. Another black spot became apparent and moved up the snow to join the other on the crest. The first then approached the great rock step and shortly emerged at the top. The second did likewise. Then the whole fascinating vision vanished, enveloped in cloud once more." Now, the thing is, nobody else was climbing Mount Everest at this time. And so the two black dots that Odell saw had to have been George and Sandy. And the exact location on Everest's ridge where Odell saw them is still kind of debated, whether it was like the first step or the second step or the third step. Like, they don't really know exactly where they were on the mountain. But it is largely accepted that this incident was the last time that the two men were ever seen alive. After the clouds closed off this sighting, just as Odell described, George and Sandy vanished into the mountain, which of course turns their fate into a mystery that people still talk about to this day. But this is way different than a normal missing persons case, because not only did their disappearance create the mystery of what happened to them, but it also created, I hate to say it, but an even juicier mystery at the same time. And that mystery, of course, is whether or not George and Sandy died before or after reaching the summit of Mount Everest. Because if they died after they summited, they would have made history. I mean, Britain would have made history. George and Sandy would have been the very first men to reach the highest point on Earth. By the time that the rest of the 1924 expedition returned back to Britain, the mountaineering community and also governments across the world were already busy trying to figure out what the hell had happened. They needed to figure out if the two men had reached the summit. Again, this is almost like being the first one to reach the moon. You know, it's a massive deal. It's a symbol of national pride. Everyone wanted to know if they had made it or not. Now, there were two main pieces of physical evidence that could potentially prove if they had reached the summit. And this evidence could potentially prove it despite George and Sandy's presumed deaths. Now, that first piece of evidence was actually a small photograph of George's wife, Ruth, which he carried with him on this final summit push. George had vowed to leave this photo of his wife on the summit of Mount Everest. And so, presumably, if the next person that reached the summit found the photo on top of the mountain, then obviously at least George and probably Sandy too had made history. They had been the first people to reach the summit, and then they died and disappeared on their way back down the mountain. Or, on the contrary, if George Mallory's body was found and the photo was still in his pocket, then that would suggest that he hadn't reached the summit, hadn't had the opportunity to leave the photo there, and he had died while either still climbing the mountain or after turning around and abandoning the summit push. So that's obviously a pretty important piece of evidence. But at the same time, we're talking about a small paper photo surviving in the harshest environment on Earth, up in the death zone of Mount Everest. I mean, even if George had made it to the summit, left the photo there, it could have easily blown away or disintegrated or gotten buried. And so it is kind of naive to say that the entire mystery of who summited Everest first rests on this one photo alone. But thankfully, there is another potential piece of evidence that could solve this mystery, and this one is much more reliable, in my opinion. This piece of evidence is a Kodak vest pocket camera that the two climbers were known to have carried on that summit push. I mean, right from the moment that George and Sandy first disappeared, everyone who had followed their story knew that this camera had the potential to literally rewrite human history forever. If the camera was found and its film was developed, which might sound crazy, but there's actually been technicians that work for Kodak who believe that it might actually be possible to develop that film if it's ever found. Anyways, if that film is developed and it showed images of Sandy and George standing on the summit, then, I mean, that would be massive, right? It would obviously prove that they made it and were the first humans to ever do so. Or on the contrary, if the film was developed and it didn't show the men on the summit, that might suggest that they didn't make it to the summit, or at the very least, it would shed some light on their timeline and could provide crucial details about their movements that day that could help bring us an answer to this mystery at some point down the line. And so now that I've kind of laid it all out there for you, I hope you understand how important this camera is. In fact, I would even go as far as to say that finding the camera was just as, if not more important than actually finding the bodies of George and Sandy themselves. And yet, despite the importance of the camera, it was never found. Or was it? You see, years would go by and the camera, the photo of George's wife, and of course the bodies of the two brave men, none of that stuff was ever found. But then, in 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay successfully summited Mount Everest and officially became the first two men to ever do so. And then, a few years later, in 1960, a Chinese expedition made history by successfully reaching Everest's summit via the North Ridge, which was the same route that George and Sandy had been attempting to take. I will say there has been some speculation that maybe the Chinese expedition might have exaggerated and hadn't actually reached the summit. I don't really know much about that. And so regardless, both that Chinese expedition and the expedition of Sir Edmund Hillary, they made headlines around the world. They were massive, massive deals. But while the world was celebrating these new human feats of achievement, these new records, many people inside the mountaineering community knew that they might not have actually been records at all. Because if George and Sandy had summited successfully years earlier, then both Sir Edmund Hillary and the Chinese's records would have been broken, 30 plus years in the past. And so the only way to solve this mystery once and for all was to find the bodies of George Mallory and Sandy Irvin, and then, even more importantly, find their camera. In 1933, an ice axe that is suspected to have belonged to Sandy was found high up on Everest. And then in 1975, there was an unconfirmed sighting of one of the men's bodies by another Chinese expedition, probably Sandy's. And these clues served as a jumping off point for what would be called the 1999 Mallory and Irvin Research Expedition, who set out on Mount Everest, not to reach the summit like everyone else, but to finally solve the mystery of who had done it first and just put this to rest once and for all. On May 1st, 1999, the very first day of their search, by the way, expedition member Conrad Anker had kind of ventured off the beaten path to search for clues. And when he did this, he noticed a very distinct patch of white kind of sticking out from the ground. Now, it's important to understand that there's a lot of bodies on Mount Everest, and so Conrad had already passed multiple dead Everest climbers on this particular day. And all of these bodies were wearing clothing that was way too modern looking to be George or Sandy. I mean, again, George and Sandy disappeared in 1924. It's not like they would have been wearing North Face clothing in 1924. And so something about this white patch caught Conrad's attention. It looked different. And so he trudged over to it, and when he finally reached it and looked down, he found a mummified body lying face down on the slope as if he had died while trying to self-arrest or like stop himself from falling. There were fragments of clothing that were still on the body, and this clearly matched the style that was worn by 1920s climbers. This was no North Face jacket, right? And so Conrad quickly radioed out to the rest of his team what he had found. Before he knew it, he was surrounded by all the other members of his expedition, and everyone there knew that a very important body had been found. They just didn't know who it was yet. Initially, the expedition actually thought that Conrad had found Sandy's body, but once they started to inspect the shirt that this mummified body was wearing, they found a label that said George Mallory. 75 years after George Mallory had vanished on Mount Everest, all of a sudden, he had been found. This was a massive, massive deal, and the discovery of George's body dropped like a bombshell within the mountaineering community. Actually, that's kind of an understatement. This was like front page news across the world. It wasn't just mountaineers that cared about this. It was a potential break in this mystery that had persisted for so many years. And while the discovery of the body did bring many new clues to light, it also raised an incredible amount of new questions. And I hate to say it, but it basically only deepened the mystery of whether or not George and Sandy had reached the summit. Now, on his person, George was found to be carrying a pair of goggles in his pocket, which means he was probably climbing at night when he fell or whatever happened. He was also carrying an altimeter, a knife, and a few handwritten letters. But noticeably absent were two very important items. Perhaps the only two items that could truly put this mystery to rest, which would, of course, be the photo of George's wife and the Kodak vest pocket camera. George didn't have the photo of his wife on his body. And of course, this was a massive deal because, well, he was going to leave it on the summit. And so if he didn't have it on him when he died, this hints at the possibility that he really did reach the summit and he left the photo there. That's why it wasn't with him when he died. However, this photo, to my knowledge anyways, has never been found. And so it's definitely intriguing and it's definitely some sort of evidence, but it's far from proof that he actually reached the summit. And of course, this raises the question, where the hell is the camera then? Oh, and also, where the hell is Sandy's body? George's body was found with some rope tied around like his waist. And so it's actually speculated, not proven, but speculated that Sandy and George might have been tied together and taken some sort of fall. And so in theory, Sandy's body could be somewhere close. But then again, it's also been years and years and years with melting ice and refreezing and, avalanches and stuff. So really his body could be anywhere. In the years that followed this 1999 expedition that found George's body, multiple new expeditions to try to find Sandy and the camera were made, but they all came up short. And interestingly enough, there was even an effort to relocate George Mallory's body, which also failed, despite the fact that the searchers knew the exact coordinates where he had been found years earlier. Now, folks, hopefully the story up to this point has been pretty fascinating, but the truth is that I haven't even told you the real conspiracy yet. I mean, yes, there's a mystery about whether they reached the summit first, but I'm actually about to get away from that just a little bit. It's time to go full conspiracy here. So put on your tinfoil hat with me, because folks, things are about to get a little bit weird. What if I told you that there is a possibility that Sandy Irvin's body had already been found long before George Mallory's was, and that the famous Kodak vest pocket camera had also been found as well? Now, to be clear, yes, this is a conspiracy, so this is not proven fact, it's just speculation, but I will say there are at least a few quite well-known and well-connected members of the mountaineering community who believe that a few members of the Chinese government might be the only people on Earth who actually know the truth about who reached Everest's summit first. So the story generally goes like this. In 1975, that Chinese expedition that I told you about earlier were up on Everest, and they stumbled upon the remains of an English climber. They were up over 26,000 feet or 8,000 meters high on Everest, like way, way up there. And with this climber's body was that Kodak camera. And so the Chinese took it and they kept it and its photos for themselves. Again, this is not proven fact, but there are a few Chinese climbers, including Pan Du, who was the first Chinese woman to ever summit Mount Everest, and actually the first woman of any nationality to summit via the North Face route. Well, her and maybe a few other climbers have allegedly made comments about finding Sandy and the camera. If you really want to dive into the source of this conspiracy, then I'm actually going to share some resources with you at the end of the video where you can do that. But for now, let's just say, just because why not? Let's just say that it is true. It is true that the Chinese found the camera. Well, that begs the question, why wouldn't they share this historical discovery with the rest of the world? Why would they have found it and then just kept it under wraps to this day? And to answer those questions, I'm going to present you with two slightly different theories. So first of all, the North Face route of Mount Everest is within the Tibetan/Chinese borders. And so that doesn't obviously justify them taking the camera. But just to be clear, it's not like they stole the camera in another country, like across international lines. They were technically within their own borders. Okay, so the first theory about why they didn't share the camera with the rest of the world is that the Chinese wanted to develop George and Sandy's photos before they announced that they found the camera. And then in the process of developing this 50-year-old film, they were either unsuccessful and couldn't get the photos, or they just botched it entirely and destroyed the film, and along with it, any chance of ever developing it. And then, in order to avoid international embarrassment and scrutiny, the Chinese decided to just cover up the entire discovery for good. Now, that's what I would describe as the more charitable theory about why they never shared the camera. The other theory suggests a cover-up for much more nefarious reasons. Some people out there speculate that the Chinese decided to keep their discovery of the camera under wraps to develop the photos quietly, and when they did this, they actually were successful. They were able to get the photos from the film, and they found that George Mallory and Sandy Irvin had in fact reached the summit of Mount Everest. The Chinese saw photos of them, ice axe in hand, triumphantly standing at the top of the world for the very first time. If this had happened and the Chinese saw these photos, it would have been a major problem for them. The reason I say that is because, once again, the Chinese claim to have completed the very first successful summit of Mount Everest from the North Face route, which again is the route that George and Sandy had taken. From my understanding, this record is a very big deal for the Chinese. It's and understandably so. You know, it's a point of national pride. And if they discovered proof that George and Sandy had reached the summit in 1924, then the Chinese record would no longer exist. Thus, the theory goes that when developing the photos and seeing proof that George and Sandy had in fact summited, the Chinese decided to destroy the camera and destroy the photos forever so that nobody could take the record away from them. And while those various, again, unproven theories account for the whereabouts of the camera, they don't quite account for the whereabouts of George and Sandy's actual bodies. And so there's actually been a few different theories about what happened to their bodies as well, you know, ranging from the Chinese removing them off the mountain after the 1909 discovery of George, all the way to the theory that the Chinese simply buried, hid, or even threw their bodies off the mountain so that they could kind of keep things sightly and clean. The fact that George Mallory's body was confirmed to have been found, like it's on camera, we know for sure that his body was found, and then years later at the same spot, the body just wasn't there anymore, that is a little suspicious, and again, is just rife for different theories and discussions about what happened. Now, if I had made this video literally on this day last year, this is where it would have ended. This is where I would have finished it. But we're not done, folks, because just a few months ago, as of the time of this recording, there was a massive break in this mystery. A break that could signal that we're actually much closer to finding an answer to this entire conspiracy than we ever thought was even possible. In late September 2024, a National Geographic documentary crew, which was led by the famous outdoor filmmaker Jimmy Chin, well, they were descending Mount Everest when they made a very peculiar discovery. While moving through a glacier, they found a discarded oxygen tank that was marked from the year 1933. Now, finding discarded equipment on Mount Everest is very common, but finding something all the way from 1933 was a lot different. That was not a normal thing. In fact, 1933 was the year that Sandy Irvin's ice axe was found high up on Mount Everest slopes. And so this discovery of the oxygen tank got the National Geographic team kind of thinking that perhaps there was more to be discovered around this particular area. They were even joking at first that they might actually be able to find Sandy Irvin himself and his camera. Jimmy Chin and his fellow climbers, well, they spent the next few days kind of searching the area until suddenly they spotted an old boot sticking out of the ice right there on Mount Everest's slope. It looked like this boot had melted out of the ice literally only a week prior. And so, you know, their hearts pounding, the team race over, they inspect this boot, and when they're looking over the sock that's kind of stuck inside of it, they saw it. They saw the name A.C. Irvin just printed on the side of it. This possibility of finding Sandy, this thing that had started out as like a joke for them, had actually turned into reality. Literally 100 years later, the very first discovery of Sandy Irvin had been made. So this is obviously a massive deal. But I will say that Jimmy Chin and his team only found Sandy's foot and his boot. They didn't find the rest of his body, and they definitely didn't find that famous camera. However, if even just a small part of Sandy was found, I think the chances that the rest of him are much higher than we ever thought possible. And of course, that also means the chances of the camera being found have gone way up as well. And perhaps the final answer to this mystery, this conspiracy that has plagued Mount Everest for a century, maybe this answer is within reach. This discovery means that we might relatively soon know if George and Sandy were the first people to reach the summit of Mount Everest. And we might also have definitive proof that this conspiracy theory about the Chinese finding the camera is not true. Or maybe we're going to find out the exact opposite. I don't really know. I don't really know who to believe or who to trust, but if you have an opinion on this wild story, I encourage you to leave it in the comments. And also, if you want to go way deeper into this mystery and this conspiracy theory, learn a little bit more about the roots of the Chinese aspect of it, kind of like I alluded to a few minutes ago. If you want to do that, I highly recommend you check out the YouTube channel Everest Mystery, which I've linked down below. Tom Pollard, who runs that channel, was actually on the expedition that found George Mallory's body back in 1999, and he has a ton of videos that go way deeper into this story and this conspiracy theory than I did. And so go check out his channel. And Tom, when you see this, thank you very much for helping me prepare this video. I hope I did the story justice. Guys, I have the best subscribers on YouTube. I appreciate all of you so much. You've literally changed my life. Oh, and YouTube seems to think that you're going to enjoy watching this video next. And so give it a click right now, and I will see you in the next one.